Hey there, viewers. Here's a question for you. How far would you go to protect family, even if it meant hiding the darkest truths? Drop your thoughts in the comments because Diddy's world just came crashing down as his own son took the stand, making scandalous accusations that left the entire courtroom in shock. And trust me, what was revealed changes everything. Buckle up. This is one story you can't miss. Let's dive in. You ever walked into a room where the air felt so heavy it threatened to smother you? Where every whisper echoes like a scream, and the scent of sweat, fear, and desperation clings to your skin like a second layer? That's what it's like in the courtroom on days like today, when a king is dragged from his throne and stripped bare before the world. The courthouse was alive with tension, buzzing like a hornet's nest on the verge of cracking open. Cameras lined the exterior, flashing relentlessly at every car door that swung open, hoping to catch a glimpse of the man at the center of the storm. Sean "Diddy" Combs. A media circus, reporters elbowing each other for the perfect shot, hands clutching microphones like spears ready to impale. Inside, the air was thick and stale, stinking of polished wood, stale sweat, and the faintest trace of coffee. You could almost taste the tension, metallic, bitter. The room itself was a contradiction. Ornate chandeliers hanging above rows of scuffed wooden benches, their once gleaming surfaces now dulled by decades of desperate hands gripping, pleading, begging for mercy. This was where power came to be humbled, where arrogance was ripped apart. It was a place where men who once controlled the world were reduced to their basest selves. Kings, moguls, gangsters, all brought to heel by the gavel's cold authority. Court officers stood along the walls, uniforms stiff and expressions blank. It was a practiced indifference, the kind that comes only from seeing monsters dressed in tailored suits, from hearing the vilest things spoken calmly and matter-of-factly. Lawyers whispered to clients, judges thumbed through files, and the jury filed in with eyes wide and hearts pounding. But all eyes were on the door. I stood at my post, back straight, hand resting on the butt of my service weapon. Just another day on duty. But there was something different today. A tension coiling tighter than usual, the kind of unease that gnawed at the gut. Even the other guards sensed it. We exchanged glances, acknowledging the storm about to break. Then, from the corridor, came the echo of shuffling footsteps, the sound of chains clinking, a metallic rattle that sent a chill up my spine. I knew that sound too well. It was the music of captivity, of shackled freedom. The door creaked open, and there he was, Sean Combs, the man who once commanded respect and fear in equal measure, now reduced to an inmate. The fall of a king. They say power makes a man larger than life, but shackles make him small. Diddy was a tall man, broad shoulders, confident swagger, but in those chains he looked diminished. Orange jumpsuit dulling the shine of his skin, the collar rumpled where 1,000 hands had tugged and choked before. The cuffs bit into his wrist, linked to the belly chain digging into his gut, and leg irons clinked with every step. But it was his eyes that drew the most attention, sharp, defiant, daring the world to stare back. The courtroom murmured like a hive stirred by smoke, whispers rippling through the benches. People craned their necks, some with morbid curiosity, others with hungry satisfaction. The fall of a powerful man draws a crowd like blood in the water. Reporters scribbled furiously, cameras clicking, recording the fallen titan. His jaw was set, the muscles clenching, a mask of stone. But I could see the anger flickering in his eyes, the same fire that made him a mogul, now raging with resentment. Beside me, my partner, Rodriguez, muttered, "Man, never thought I'd see him like this." I didn't reply. My eyes stayed locked on Diddy. He was sizing up the room, eyes darting from the prosecutor's table to the judge's bench, assessing the threat. calculating. We led him forward, his chains clinking louder in the silence. He scanned the faces in the gallery, some shocked, others smug. Fans and haters, spectators in the theater of destruction. His gaze swept over them, lingering on a few familiar faces. Industry associates, former friends, vultures now circling the carcass of his legacy. But then his eyes settled on a figure near the back, a young man with eyes just like his own. The tension in the room cranked up tenfold. Diddy's expression wavered, a flash of something almost vulnerable flickering across his face before it hardened again. I recognized the kid, Justin Combs, Diddy's own flesh and blood, the son who stood to inherit a kingdom, the son whose testimony today could seal his father's fate. Shackled kings and sinister grins. Diddy's eyes stayed locked on Justin's, a silent conversation screaming across the room. Fear, desperation, fury, hard to say. Justin looked away, jaw clenched tight, his own expression hardening. He had the look of a man carrying a heavy burden, a weight he was about to unload. Rodriguez and I guided Diddy to the defense table, unhooked the cuffs but left the leg irons on. Standard procedure. Didn't stop Diddy from giving me a glare that could freeze hell. I met his stare and shrugged. Just doing my job. He didn't look away, eyes burning with defiance. He was a man who'd always been in control, a puppet master pulling strings from the shadows. Now he was the one dancing to the tune, a king in chains stripped of his crown. The judge entered, robes flowing, gavel in hand. The room stood, then sat in unison. Diddy's lawyers flanked him, sharp suits, polished shoes, false smiles. The kind who'd defend the devil himself for the right price. They whispered to him, their tones urgent, but he just leaned back, arrogance radiating off him in waves. But I could see it, the crack in his armor. Judge Harlan cleared his throat, eyes narrowing at Diddy with the kind of disdain reserved for the truly guilty. "The court is now in session," he announced, the words slicing through the room like a knife. The prosecutor stood, a woman with cold eyes and a reputation for tearing men apart on the stand. She addressed the jury, setting the stage, painting Diddy as a man consumed by power, a tyrant who crushed anyone in his way. The charges were read out: money laundering, racketeering, conspiracy, violence. The list went on and the room buzzed with unease. The charges alone could bury a man. Diddy's expression didn't waver. The king, still refusing to bow. But then the prosecutor called her first witness. The room held its breath as Justin Combs was sworn in. The boy's hands trembled as he took the stand, but his gaze was steely. Eyes locked on his father, he spoke the oath, voice steady despite the quake in his hands. He looked at Diddy, a gaze heavy with betrayal, sorrow, and grim determination. Diddy stared back, and for a moment, the courtroom felt like a battlefield. Father and son, king and heir, judge and executioner. The prosecutor wasted no time. "Justin, can you tell us about your relationship with your father?" Justin took a breath, the weight of the world pressing on his shoulders. "He's my father," he began, voice tight, "but he's also a man who hides dark secrets, things I can't ignore anymore." The room gasped. Diddy's eyes narrowed, a flash of fury igniting. Justin's jaw clenched. "And today, I'm here to tell you the truth." The courtroom erupted, chaos unfolding as the first blow was struck. The king's crown was cracking, and Diddy's world was about to crumble. The air inside the courtroom was a storm held in suspense, tension hanging heavy, pressing down like the weight of 100 restless souls. The whisper of suits brushing against worn wooden benches, the soft shuffling of feet, and the creak of chairs being adjusted. But despite the murmurs and fidgeting, The eyes of every soul in that room were locked onto the man who sat with his back straight and his head held high. Sean "Diddy" Combs. The first few minutes after Justin's testimony had sent shockwaves through the courtroom. But as the initial shock settled, it became clear that something was terribly wrong. Diddy didn't seem fazed. Not a flicker of fear crossed his face. Not a bead of sweat formed on his brow. The man who once ruled the music industry sat there, cold, unblinking, and detached, as if the room around him was nothing more than an inconvenience. Even as Justin recounted the whispers of threats, the suffocating pressure of expectations, and the way his father's empire had become a labyrinth of darkness, Diddy remained unmoved. His jawline cut sharp, lips pressed thin, and eyes devoid of emotion. An impenetrable fortress. The look of a man who believed he was untouchable. Justin's testimony had been damning, but the prosecutors were just getting started. The first witness, a ghost from the past. "All rise," the bailiff barked, the command pulling everyone back to rigid attention. The judge re-entered, and the heavy thud of the gavel striking wood signaled the continuation. "Prosecution may call their next witness," Judge Harlan said, voice hard as stone. The prosecutor, Ms. Madison, a sharp-eyed woman with a predatory focus, nodded. "The state calls Monique Patterson to the stand." There was a rustle of movement. The doors at the back of the courtroom opened, and a woman emerged, her presence commanding but haunted. She was middle-aged, with the kind of beauty that defied time, but the lines etched around her eyes told a story of sleepless nights and quiet despair. The room tensed as she walked forward, head held high, but gaze flicking nervously toward Diddy. She glanced at him, and for a split second, fear flashed in her eyes. Diddy didn't even blink. His face was a mask, hard, cold, indifferent. Monique took the oath, hands trembling. The prosecutor wasted no time. "Ms. Patterson, can you please state your relationship to Sean Combs?" Monique hesitated. She looked to Diddy again, then away quickly, as if the very sight of him burned her. "We were involved years ago," she said, voice wavering but strong. "And during this involvement, did you witness any illegal activities conducted by Mr. Combs?" The pause was long, painful. Monique's eyes dropped to her lap, fingers clenching the hem of her blouse. But then she looked up, determination steeling her. "Yes," she said, and the courtroom gasped. She spoke of intimidation, threats, manipulation, a world where loyalty was demanded and betrayal meant ruin. Stories of artists strong-armed into contracts, business partners reduced to pawns, and enemies crushed under the weight of Diddy's empire. A tyrant cloaked in wealth and influence. But as she spoke, detailing moments of cruelty and control, Diddy's expression remained unchanged. A flicker of a smirk, if anything. It was like he wasn't even listening. Monique's voice cracked as she mentioned the late-night phone calls, threats that left her shaking, desperate pleas that went unanswered. Tears filled her eyes, but she swallowed them down, speaking her truth despite the fear. Diddy's eyes slid over her, apathetic, almost bored. "Thank you, Ms. Patterson," the prosecutor said, dismissing her. She looked relieved to leave the stand, but her eyes never met Diddy's again. The second witness, a betrayed protege. "The prosecution calls Trevor Miles to the stand," Ms. Madison announced. This time a man emerged, a thin figure with tattoos snaking up his neck and a scowl etched deep into his face. He looked rough around the edges, but there was a flicker of fear beneath his tough facade. He glanced at Diddy and tried to hold his glare, but it crumbled. Diddy's eyes slid to him, heavy with the weight of 1,000 unspoken warnings. Trevor took the oath, jaw set. The prosecutor's questions were swift. "You worked with Mr. Combs in the past?" "Yeah," Trevor answered, voice hard. I was part of Bad Boy. Producer, talent scout, you name it. And during your time working for Mr. Combs, did you witness any illegal activities? Trevor hesitated. His eyes darted toward Diddy, then back to Ms. Madison. Yeah, he said finally. A lot of people didn't make it out clean. A lot of favors called in. The kind of stuff that makes you dirty even if you ain't doing it yourself. He detailed payoffs, coercion, and a chokehold on the industry. Stories of young artists signing contracts with dreams of fame, only to find themselves bound by iron chains. Deals that ruined lives and ended careers. Trevor's hands trembled. You did what you were told. Didn't ask questions. If you did, you disappeared. He stared at Diddy, eyes filled with resentment and fear. People went missing. That's all I'm saying. But Diddy was unmoved, a flicker of annoyance, if anything. He leaned back, calm and composed, like he was bored by the performance. A web of lies and silence. One by one, the victims came. Industry insiders, ex-girlfriends, associates, and even former bodyguards. They painted a picture of a man who controlled, manipulated, and destroyed. A man who ruled with fear, forcing silence with money and threats. And through it all, Diddy never flinched. A king unbothered. The stories grew darker. Tales of violence, exploitation, and the sinister undercurrent of something unspeakable. The room was tense, shoulders stiffening, as accounts of brutality and coercion filled the air. But Diddy leaned back, expression detached. Eyes half-lidded like a king on his throne, unbothered by the cries of the peasants. The victims grew angrier, voices trembling with rage and fear. The prosecutor's tone became sharper, more accusatory. The judge's gaze hardened. The jury's expressions twisted with disgust. And yet, Sean Diddy Combs looked unfazed. I watched him, the chill creeping up my spine. This was a man who feared nothing. Not the system, not the accusations, not even his own blood. A man who'd stared down death and didn't blink. Rodriguez leaned closer. Man's ice cold, he muttered. I could only nod, because deep down I realized something unsettling. The man on trial wasn't afraid. He was waiting. And in his eyes I saw it. A flicker of amusement, a hint of a smile. A king who knew the game better than anyone else. The courtroom was electric, charged with a tension so thick it seemed to pulse through the air. The weight of testimony after testimony had piled up like a mountain of damning evidence. Yet Sean Diddy Combs sat unflinching. The man exuded an unnatural calm, a predator's stillness, the kind of composure that came from years of calculated control. I'd seen hardened criminals face the judge with less fear. Gang leaders, killers, men whose bodies were inked with the stories of their crimes. They all trembled before the system, knowing the scales of justice could tip against them. But not Diddy. He was a different breed. A beast with eyes that seemed to mock the very walls built to contain him. I could hear the whispers around me, lawyers muttering, reporters scribbling, families of victims glaring. It felt like everyone was waiting for something, for the moment this man would finally crack. But Diddy's cold, detached demeanor made me wonder if that moment would ever come. Then, the prosecutor's voice cut through the hum of anticipation. Your Honor, the state calls Christian Combs to the stand. The room collectively stiffened. Gasps echoed like distant thunder. I saw Diddy's shoulders twitch, the first real sign of emotion I'd seen from him all day. His eyes narrowed, and for a split second, the mask slipped, an expression of cold fury, the kind that promised pain. The doors at the back of the courtroom swung open, and in stepped Christian Combs. He looked almost exactly like his father, sharp features, confident stance, but the resemblance ended there. Diddy's son had a haunted look in his eyes, the gaze of a man who'd seen too much. The courtroom was dead silent, every eye fixed on the young man walking to the witness stand. Even I felt a chill. This was no ordinary witness. This was blood. A tense introduction. The bailiff administered the oath, and Christian's voice was steady. "I swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. So help me God." He settled into the chair, hands gripping the edge as if it was the only thing anchoring him. He looked straight ahead, eyes flicking to his father. Diddy's face was expressionless again, cold and unreadable. The prosecutor, Ms. Madison, leaned forward. "Christian, can you please state your relationship to Sean Combs?" "My father," Christian answered, voice low. The words seemed to linger, heavy with unspoken things. "And you understand the seriousness of this testimony?" "I do," he replied, tone steady. But there was a tremor beneath the surface, a crack in the armor. Ms. Madison nodded. "Tell us, Christian, what was it like growing up as the son of Sean Combs?" He took a deep breath. "It was intimidating," he admitted. "He was a powerful man, always in control. At home, he was the same as in public, controlling, demanding. But there was more." "More?" Ms. Madison pressed. Christian hesitated, jaw clenching. He looked at Diddy, eyes locking, and something flickered in his gaze. Fear, regret, resentment. "Yes," he said. "Much more. My father? He's a monster." The words crashed into the room like a grenade. Gasps, murmurs, shock rippled through the crowd. Even I felt the jolt, a statement so raw and damning it felt unreal. But Diddy, he didn't move. Not a twitch, not a blink. He sat back, hands clasped, eyes boring into his son. The temperature in the room seemed to drop. The dark confessions begin. "Mr. Combs," Ms. Madison continued, leaning closer, "can you elaborate on what you mean by that?" Christian looked down, visibly wrestling with himself. The judge watched intently, eyebrows drawn. I could see reporters scribbling furiously, their pens racing to capture every word. Christian swallowed hard. "He used me," he said, voice cracking. "He used me to send messages, threats. He made me keep secrets, dark secrets. I was just a kid, but he made me complicit." The courtroom collectively held its breath. Ms. Madison pressed on. "What kind of threats?" Christian's gaze dropped. "Anyone who crossed him, artists, competitors, even family. He would tell me things, make me repeat his threats, so the message came from me. He said it was about teaching me power." The prosecutor's voice was sharp. "Are you saying your father manipulated you into threatening people on his behalf?" "Yes," Christian replied, bitterness dripping from his tone. "He made me believe it was strength, showing dominance. But I knew it was wrong. I was just a kid." A murmur rippled through the room. Diddy's jaw clenched, the mask cracking. A glimmer of anger flashed in his eyes. "And did this manipulation stop when you became an adult?" Ms. Madison asked. Christian shook his head. "Number it got worse. He would remind me how easily things could go wrong for me, how quickly my life could be destroyed if I ever crossed him." A monster unveiled. The room was ice cold now, every breath hushed. The air crackled with anticipation. Ms. Madison's voice was a knife. "Christian, did your father ever physically threaten you?" The hesitation was enough of an answer. Christian's eyes flicked to Diddy, then away. He took a breath, a shuddering gasp. "Yes," he admitted. "It was never direct, never something you could prove. But he would say things. Things like, 'A lion eats its own cubs if they step out of line.' I knew what he meant." He paused, fighting for composure. I was always scared. Always. The silence that followed was suffocating. Even I felt the pressure. It was hard to breathe, hard to think, like the room itself was struggling under the weight of what was being said. Diddy sat back, a cold fury brewing in his gaze. The mask had slipped. Pure rage now, barely contained. Ms. Madison's tone grew more intense. "Christian, is there anything else you want to say to this court?" He looked up, defiance burning in his eyes. "Yeah," he said. "My father's not a mogul. He's not a king. He's a monster. And he used me to build his empire, at the cost of everything." The silence before the storm. For a moment, the courtroom was a vacuum, soundless, motionless. The judge leaned forward, jaw clenched, eyes blazing. The jury looked horrified. Ms. Madison's face was a mask of grim satisfaction. But then, the faintest of smiles tugged at Diddy's lips. It was brief, a flicker of something dark and knowing. He leaned back, unafraid. And I realized, the man didn't care. He knew something we didn't. The feeling crawled up my spine. The certainty that we were all missing a crucial piece of this nightmare. And Diddy knew it. The air in the courtroom was electric, charged with a volatile mix of shock, betrayal, and disbelief. For a moment, the chaos of whispers and gasps swallowed the room whole. But when the echo of Christian Combs's words finally settled, it left a chilling silence behind. Diddy Sean Combs, the man who once commanded the world's attention with charisma and power, sat motionless. His jaw was clenched, eyes burning with an intensity I'd never seen before. The mask of confidence he'd worn so easily throughout the trial was gone. But it wasn't just anger. There was something deeper etched into his expression. Confusion, disbelief, maybe even fear. Christian's damning testimony hung heavy in the air. The young man stood resolute, the trembling in his hands betraying the strength in his voice. There was pain there, years of suppressed rage, regret, and bitterness, all bleeding out under the harsh lights of the courtroom. Diddy's eyes narrowed, and he leaned forward, his stare boring into his son. He spoke with a deliberate calmness that made the hair on my arms stand on end. "Why?" Diddy's voice was low, cold, tinged with something dangerous. "Why would you say these things?" Christian's gaze didn't waver. If anything, he seemed to steel himself further, drawing from a well of courage only desperation can provide. "Because it's enough," Christian replied, his voice hoarse but firm. "It's been enough for a long time." Diddy's expression flickered, confusion mingled with disbelief. For a brief moment, he looked like a father, not a mogul, not a kingpin, just a man grappling with the betrayal of his own flesh and blood. The unraveling. "You don't know what you're talking about," Diddy snapped, the calm veneer cracking. "You're confused. They've twisted your mind, boy." "I'm not confused," Christian shot back. "I've been silent for too long. You controlled me, manipulated me. You made me complicit in things I can't even say out loud. It's over, Dad. I'm done protecting you." The words cut deeper than any knife. The room buzzed with anticipation. Even the judge leaned forward, eyes sharp with scrutiny. "You think you're helping yourself?" Diddy scoffed, anger clouding his expression. "You're just digging your own grave. I protected you. I gave you power." Christian's lips curled into a bitter smile. "Power? You made me a puppet. You pulled the strings, used me to clean up your messes. Every dirty secret you buried, I had to watch it happen. And if I didn't play along..." He trailed off, jaw tightening. Ms. Madison, the prosecutor, seized the moment. "Mr. Combs," she interjected, her tone sharp, "what did your father do when you refused to cooperate?" Christian's gaze drifted back to Diddy. There was hatred there, cold, consuming, and fierce. He'd make examples, he answered. I saw what happened to people who crossed him. Ruined careers, disappearances, threats. I was afraid, terrified of what he'd do to me, to my family. He made it clear I wasn't safe if I stepped out of line. The courtroom erupted into a storm of murmurs. The judge's gavel struck the bench like a gunshot, silencing the room. A father's fury. Diddy's composure shattered. He surged to his feet, hands slamming onto the table. His lawyer, clearly panicked, reached out to pull him back, but the man was beyond reasoning. You ungrateful little... Diddy spat, eyes blazing. I built a legacy. Everything you have, everything you are, came from me. And you stand here spewing this poison? Christian didn't flinch. You built a kingdom of lies, he shot back. You used me, manipulated me. You're not a father. You're a tyrant. You controlled everyone, family, friends, rivals. It's over. You don't know what you're talking about, Diddy shouted. You don't know the first thing about survival, about power. Christian's eyes hardened. Maybe not, but I know enough to stop you. The past comes to light. Ms. Madison's voice sliced through the tension. Christian, can you tell the court about the threats your father made against your life? Diddy's glare could have cut steel, but Christian met it head on. He'd say things, Christian admitted. He'd tell me a lion eats its own cubs. He'd remind me of people who vanished, people who got too close or crossed him. And when I tried to walk away from it all, he made sure I knew just how easily he could ruin me. The judge's expression was stone, but his eyes held a trace of pity, directed not at Diddy, but at Christian. Did he ever act on these threats? Ms. Madison asked. Christian hesitated, then nodded. Not directly, but people around me would suffer. Close friends would lose opportunities. Deals would fall through. He made life hell for anyone who stood against him. And if I ever tried to speak out, he'd make sure I regretted it. The courtroom was ice cold now. The tension was suffocating. I could see jurors shifting uncomfortably, their gazes flicking between father and son. The breaking point. Diddy's voice was a growl. I protected you from the wolves, taught you strength, power, everything you needed to survive. And this is how you repay me? Christian's composure wavered, grief etching lines into his face. You didn't protect me, you caged me. You made me a pawn in your twisted game, and I was too afraid to break free. Until now. Diddy's sneer twisted into something darker. You'll regret this, boy. You don't understand what you're doing. Christian squared his shoulders, eyes blazing. No, Dad, you're the one who doesn't understand. The legacy you built, it ends here, with me. For a moment, Diddy's mask slipped, and I saw something flicker in his eyes, fear. Not for himself, but for his empire, the kingdom he ruled with fear and manipulation. And in that instant, I knew the unthinkable had happened. Sean Diddy Combs had finally been cornered. The courtroom buzzed as Ms. Madison leaned back, satisfied. The judge's gaze hardened. This court will take a brief recess, the judge declared, striking the gavel. We will reconvene shortly. Christian shot one last glance at his father, a mixture of pity, regret, and unshakable resolve. And Diddy's face, once a mask of arrogance and control, had become a twisted blend of fury, betrayal, and something else. Something even colder. The guards led Diddy away, but his eyes never left his son's face. The look promised retribution. As the courtroom emptied, the storm brewing around Sean Combs was far from over. And for the first time, I wondered if the man who always controlled everything was finally losing control. The courtroom was heavy with the weight of what had just been revealed. The air was thick, buzzing with the tension of unspoken words and exchanged glances. It felt like everyone, jurors, spectators, even the courtroom staff, was holding their breath, as if one wrong move might shatter the fragile calm. Diddy's name had once been synonymous with power, luxury, and control. Now it echoed like a curse, a reminder of the man who built an empire on fear, manipulation, and buried secrets. I stood at the side of the room, watching as he was escorted back to his seat. The swagger he once carried, the unshakable confidence that used to fill a room, it was all gone. His shoulders were hunched, eyes glaring at the floor, lips twisted into a scowl. But beneath that mask of anger, I saw it, the creeping realization that the end was near, a kingdom crumbling. The judge's gavel slammed down, pulling the courtroom back into order. The murmurs and whispers faded. Diddy's eyes flicked to his son, Christian, who stood with his back straight and chin high, a young man no longer in his father's shadow. He'd faced the beast and won, but the battle had clearly taken its toll. Christian's gaze never wavered, even as his father's cold stare burned holes into him. The judge leaned forward, his expression stern. "We will resume testimony," he announced. "Mr. Combs, the court has heard troubling accusations today. Do you wish to address them?" Diddy's lawyer scrambled to his feet, hands shaking. "Your Honor, my client reserves the right to remain silent." "Speak for yourself," Diddy snapped, brushing the man off. He glared at the judge, jaw clenched. "You want my response? Fine." The courtroom stilled, anticipation crackling in the air. The final defense. Diddy leaned back, a bitter smile stretching across his face. "You all sit here and listen to lies, wild stories from people who've turned on me. My own son," he sneered, glaring at Christian. "A boy who'd be nothing without my name. You think this is the truth? You think you know me?" Christian's expression hardened. "I built an empire," Diddy continued, his voice growing louder. "Fought my way to the top, while the rest of you were happy being nobodies. You call it crime. I call it survival. The strong eat, the weak get eaten. That's the way of the world." The judge's eyes narrowed. "Mr. Combs, are you admitting to these crimes?" Diddy scoffed. "I'm admitting that power doesn't come from playing by the rules. You don't understand what it takes to make it." Ms. Madison, the prosecutor, stepped forward. "So, you justify manipulation, threats, and destruction of lives as survival tactics?" He shot her a glare. "You'd be dead in a week on my side of the fence. All of you would." Christian didn't react, just watched, cold and steady. The last stand. The judge sighed, tired of the bravado. "Mr. Combs, the court is not here to debate your worldview. We are here to determine your guilt or innocence based on the evidence." Diddy's shoulders tensed. The room was a pressure cooker, seconds away from bursting. "I'm a king," Diddy spat, defiance blazing in his eyes. "I built this life. You want to tear me down? Fine. But you can't erase what I've done. My name will live on." A sneer tugged at his lips. "And you," he said, eyes locking onto Christian, "you're just a scared little boy playing hero. You think they'll protect you now? You think you're free?" Christian met his father's gaze. "I don't need protection anymore," he said. "You don't own me. Not anymore." For a heartbeat, Diddy's mask cracked. Just a flicker of panic, but he quickly masked it with rage. The verdict. The judge leaned forward, his expression cold. "The court has heard enough. We will take a brief recess before delivering the verdict." The gavel struck, and the courtroom erupted. Reporters shouted questions. Flashes from cameras lit up the room, and the murmur of voices grew frantic. Diddy's lawyer tried to calm him, But Diddy jerked away, eyes locked on Christian. I was close enough to see the raw fury, the desperation of a man whose empire had turned to ash. Diddy was cuffed and escorted out. He shot Christian a final glare, the kind of look that promised vengeance, a promise to haunt from the grave if he had to. But Christian stood tall, unflinching. I could see it, the relief washing over him, the freedom breaking through years of chains, the fall of the king. We returned after what felt like an eternity. The judge's expression was grim, his eyes fixed on Diddy. The room was silent, an oppressive, suffocating silence. Sean Combs, this court finds you guilty on multiple counts, including conspiracy, extortion, and endangerment, the judge declared. You are hereby sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. Gas rippled through the room. Christian exhaled, the weight of years sliding off his shoulders. Diddy didn't flinch, his face carved from stone, but his eyes, those cold, predator,